Good evening, everybody. We are continuing our work in Chapter 4 this week. Last week we were able to basically build the application from scratch again and experiment with a bunch of different things. And I want to kind of focus on what some of the key takeaways were from last week. Um, First of all, I should open up a new browser tab here and bring our course shell in, which I don't have. Um, I want to point out a couple of things for you within the course shell. And I know that this is dated material, so maybe next time I run this course this won't apply, but this is the summer of 2018. This is actually the first time I'm teaching a .NET 2 course where this material was previously bundled in to a different version of .NET, and we taught MVC, and all the technologies change. But case in point is really that the course shell is kind of being built from scratch as we go. Normally when I teach a class, I have everything already there, right? This is not one of those circumstances. I'm building on the fly. I'm not embarrassed to admit that because it's just the reality of it, and there's nothing wrong with that. And therefore it becomes kind of a process of exploration. But what I do want to show you is that the Unit 3 folder does contain an assignment now, but it is not a regular assignment. It's an extra credit assignment. And I'm discovering that the author has changed his approach in the different versions of the textbook. I had used the previous version of the book where he built this MVC Music Store very much step by step all the way through in that sort of a format. It's like step 1, do this, step 2, do that. And it was really nice to follow. What ended up happening, though, is MVC changed, so he started writing about the new MVC approaches and didn't really, I think, update the assignment parts of it. And so I'm stuck in this conundrum right now where I'm going to be kind of like working through how I'm going to present this to you, if I'm going to just lecture on it and demo it using a different project. My preference would be to use the music store. That's going to take a little bit of effort on my part to kind of turn it into a step-by-step. And frankly, I get a little impatient coming up with instructions like that, and I don't know if you guys have ever been in that type of situation where somebody says, how do I, right? And even to the point, I don't know if you guys ever played with a product in Windows called Windows Step Recorder. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah, it's built into Windows since XP. And basically what it does is you hit a button and it starts to capture all the movements you do on the screen and turns it into a set of instructions. It'll say, like, go to the file menu, click on exit, or copy and paste, and then do this and then do that, and that just watches what you do on the screen and does that. So I wish I had a piece of software that would watch me build the application and do that, but I would hate to have to type it out. So what I'm telling you up front is that there might be a little course correction going on here as we proceed, and it kind of began in Unit 3 when I realized that he wasn't actually building the application here, but he had you import a package that had a pre-built one where you could just look at what was done. To me, while that's helpful, isn't really the same as putting your hands on it and building something and having it work and not work and then figuring out how to make it work, which is where the value is. So I'm going to be attempting over the next few weeks as we proceed to kind of find a way to do that, just short of actually writing those instructions out. So if I do happen to write them out, I will share them with you, but I just want to let you know that. So if you do want to do the exercises in Chapter 3, some of the activities, I made some notes here for you, and it's not an obligation that you do this. Remember, it's extra credit. There's no due date on it, but it is worth up to 2 extra credit points, and at some point along the way, you might say, hey, I need those 2 points. And the work in this chapter is actually very simplistic and not a big deal. So feel free to go back and actually do that. But we are in Unit 4 right now where we are working with models. And just to kind of reiterate some of the things that we learned, so I'm just doing a little zoom here. These are the topics in Chapter 4 that I took as key takeaways. And just to reiterate them as we finish up the chapter, we are working with this architecture called MVC, and obviously this chapter is about the M of MVC called models, and models really translate to data. Now what data is to an application really depends on what approach you take, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can feed data in. A classic way is to use a database or a flat file or a text file, and that's absolutely fine. But that approach would usually rely on data pre-existing. What we do in an MVC application is we imply data structures by building models with code. And we saw that where we built basically these little class files that would have certain fields with getters and setters. And then we would set ID fields by name, and then the scaffolding feature that's built into ASP.NET and MVC recognized the relationships automatically. And if we didn't have a database attached, what did it do? It created one on the fly, right? And then we also learned what problems that can cause when we try to make adjustments and we go back and the database is up and running and we have to disconnect and do all that stuff. But the other real key part here is with scaffolding, and a real critical takeaway from MVC is this: once we have these data models built, is that how scaffolding rapidly builds the capabilities to not only display the data that we've generated, but to be able to edit and delete and destroy and all that stuff, the CRUD operations. Now, what we're up to at this point is getting to the point where we're doing a little bit of editing of an actual record album. So like we have the application, it's running, and actually before we dig back in and do code, the first thing we should do is get this up and running and make sure it's okay, right? So let's start by doing that. So fire up your Visual Studio if you haven't already, and then go ahead and open the last iteration of your music store. All right, let's let everything get loaded up here. On the right-hand side here, right now, I see that I'm in the Server Explorer window, and I do want to actually be in the Solution Explorer. And then you can take a look at some of the pages that we had open just before we stopped working last time. And one of the things that we did use to do our scaffolding was the Store Manager controller, if you guys remember doing that. And how this built up automatically, recognizing relationships between all the different things in our database. We didn't write any of this code. This was all done automatically. That was done based on the fact that we created some of these files, right? And these are very simple files. Really all we're doing is setting kind of like fields or columns for a table or a database, setting a data type, and allowing getters and setters so they can be created and destroyed, or set values for them. And we did that with album, artist, and genre. And notice how each one of these, if you look at the top row of each one, how each one has an ID field. And then notice how the album class, which is the one that we use to do the scaffolding, had ID links to each one of the other tables. And that's what the scaffolding mechanism used to kind of build out that other stuff automatically. Now for me, I find that just like kind of miraculously cool that somebody even thought to do this, because it really saves a lot of work and gives you all the functionality you need kind of like straight away out of the box. All right, so now that we have that up, let's go ahead and hit the play button and see if this will run, right? We kind of make the assumption it will. But you guys are going to start to learn that there's, a lot of times that you shouldn't make any assumptions when you're working with this kind of technology, because it's not like working with a simple web page. So let's make sure that this is all cool before we get too far. So we're trying to be patient here. And we do have the site up. And what link were we going to? Store Manager, right? And there it is. Where we actually are able to pull up information that's in the database, and then we also have some of the extra features here. Another key takeaway here, and this has kind of been building up over time here, is the purpose and the function of the URL in an MVC application. Because we end up with what looks like a clean URL structure. And very often these refer to certain aspects of our application. So the very first part, obviously, if we were to apply a regular host, here, so like if you had like a whatever.com or whatever your website is. But then once you get past that first slash, then we start to recognize that the first thing that we're really calling is what? We're calling a controller, is what we're doing. And then within a controller, we're calling a particular method. In this case, the index method, which brings up this particular view. And then often, and this is what we're moving into next part of the chapter here, there might be things that follow and we get longer URLs, but really they have purposes. And often when you get past like 1 or 2 or 3 entries here, you're looking at parameter passing to your application via the URL, either done by a mouse click or a form entry or automatically based upon some code that you've written on the back end. But from a conceptual standpoint, I think that's pretty interesting as well. You see that approach used a lot on websites these days. So really, you're not seeing file and folder structure. You're not like tracing down where people are storing files. You're seeing the result of applications running on a server somewhere. It's just that whatever you're seeing comes back to a browser as opposed to your operating system. And that's really why this technology, frankly, is pretty important these days. All right, so let's jump back to page 97, I believe. And we're going to pick up right on this section here about editing an album. And let's begin by kind of reading this highlight that I put in here. And clearly they're going to ask us to edit an album. Now, we put an album in, and we're going to kind of futz with it a little bit. And notice it says here, when the edit link sends an HTTP GET request to the server with a URL such as store manager /edit 5, where 5 is the ID of a specific album. So in other words, that 5 refers to the ID value for that album entry in the database. So it is passing of a parameter, folks. That's what's happening there. All right, so if we happen to, let's say, click on this link, and I'm not clicking yet, so if you clicked, I'm sorry. But notice that as I'm hovering, the way bottom right corner of my browser down here, the URL will pop up, and you'll see right there that it'll say store manager edit /1, because this is the only album that's in our application right now, and as a result, the ID value in our database indeed is, ID 0. Brian says it's 0. So it's 0. No, it's not. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not going to discount that, but if the application is set up a certain way, right. So now, I went ahead and I clicked on the actual edit button, and now you can see the URL up top is indeed that. So really what that's doing for us in the form of a GET, and that's an important thing too. The GET is the method of passing the data, which just simply means it's visible in the URL. What happens after that when the server receives it is up to the application. In traditional HTML programming, it's file and folder. Here, it's controllers, methods, and parameters as a general rule. So somewhere in our application, we have methods that are being called. So inside the store manager, there's a method called edit that receives a parameter. Notice the question mark. It's kind of a curious little thing there. That comes in as an ID, and it says if the ID is null, it's a bad request. Okay, so something went wrong. But if it actually has a value, then it will actually find that ID in the database of albums and then return a view, pulling back the information and displaying it, hopefully, nicely in the table. Now, Brian, you had a question? That's an excellent question, right? So Brian's question is the database not zero-based? Like, shouldn't the first ID value be zero? And apparently not. Now, how could we check that? We could actually go into the Server Explorer, go into the database, look in the tables, and see. That would be one thing. So the way that they've put the application together, or the tools together, apparently it auto increments ID values. And I guess it would make sense to start counting with one, because humans do. So that's my thinking there. All right, but you see that we didn't code this once again. This is just an automatically generated interface. Nothing fancy, but it doesn't look bad, right? And then it allows us, by virtue of these drop-down boxes, to actually choose our categories. It allows us to choose our artists. We don't have a lot in there right now. I'm not even sure if Rush has an album called Caravan. I kind of guess I gave up, sooner than that. I'm buying their records, but I don't doubt that they do. And then they also have a spot here for album art URL. So if you had like a link to, wherever you keep your images in your application, you could drop that in here and pull the image back. Now, of course, we could go ahead and make a change. In fact, let's bump up the price to $15.99, just because. And let's go ahead and click Save and see if it even works. And you know what? It does. Okay, so that's the edit feature there. You may as well check out the other buttons, right? I really don't want to click Delete, right? Because then we're going to end up with a database with nothing in it. But we can look at the details, and it just basically reiterates the same thing. Notice, once again, up in the URL, this is the key takeaways here, folks, is that now we're calling a method called details. And we're passing to it a parameter once again. So you should know that if we go back to our application, even while it's running, and we look in the Store Manager controller, we should be able to find here a method called edit. That's the one that we were looking at in the book, right? And ideally, we should be able to find one called details, right? So checks to see if it exists. If not, it throws a bad request message. Otherwise, it goes ahead and it finds that particular ID, and then it returns a view of the album. And then that, of course, is what puts it up on the screen. All right. Key takeaways. So try to keep those in mind. All right. I'm going to jump back over to the text now. And I know that the author, you can tell he's doing basically what I just did. It shows you the code. All right, the next thing he's going to show us here is when we were working with that in the browser, and we click the edit link, how is it generating these drop-down lists to pull in that information? Well, there's a little clue in actually the column name here. So remember how the album model that we built had the genre ID and the artist ID along with the album ID. Now the album ID we know is 1 because it's right up here in the URL, but that's not displayed on the page. It's not really relevant, right? But because of that, this allows the genre ID to tie over to the other tables, and what it's doing here is it's pulling in all the options that were available from the other tables into the drop-down list and doing that automatically. And it does so by virtue of these couple simple little lines of code. So it's a drop-down list with the genre ID, and it says string empty. And notice that the second one here says a validation method for model.genreid. Notice, some of the syntax things here. Now, a lot of this stuff, you have to remember when you're working with these tools, a lot of this stuff is done automatically for you. So chances that you're hand coding it will be slim to none. Where you're going to step in is when you're needing to tweak something to make it do something else or to make it do something more, usually. Or you don't need that feature, you want a different feature, or wouldn't it be nice if, and then you're in the situation where you start figuring it out. All right. All right, in this next section, he starts talking about something that he talked about earlier in the book. And, he talked about this thing called a view-specific model. He thinks that this album scenario is worthy example of this. He says your model object in the album doesn't quite contain all the information required by the view to make it happen, really, because the genre is stored in a different table. The artist is stored in a different table. So in order to get you actually a complete view, like in the details view or even in the edit mode, it requires that connection to the other table. So what he's saying is that there's two different ways to do this. And the two different methods have both, I say this, both have their value, but the people that really like to build things that are directly tied to data will prefer this approach here, which is to build a view-specific model that will pull in both pieces of information directly. So what that means is people that are really data-oriented might go to the trouble of creating another model that they just pull in directly rather than use the approach that's doing right now. So in other words, instead of pulling in two separate tables, they set up another data structure that it's already done that work for them, right? And basically consolidates it into one spot. Which is better? It's kind of, in my mind, it's kind of a horse apiece, and it really will depend on like the work paradigm of like the data-driven people that you're building with. So for example, if you are working with like database people who are all about like normalization, and I don't know if you guys probably haven't worked professionally yet with database people that are like that, but there's some people that run databases that are data Nazis, and they should be, because if they have databases that like gigabytes of data in them, normalization and how you organize your data is critical to making it work efficiently. And in those cases, you'll probably be more apt to see that a lot of generation of additional data models that cover certain scenarios so that you don't have to create them on the fly. Does that necessarily make an application run better? Depends on the volume of data is really kind of the answer there. All right. The other thing that the author wants us to look at here is what some of this code looks like. And if you take a look at this little next section here, he says it's not exactly what's inside the edit view, but it does represent the essence of it. So the real key takeaway here is the fact that we are using these HTML razor tools, basically, that allow us to generate these fields. It's kind of like using ASP syntax. So the drop-down list, there will be nothing probably that'll pop up here that will surprise you. But you notice the ones that are using drop-down lists, it's pretty clear, and it's pretty clear what you're pulling from. And then when you actually have a field where you can change content, and often that will be a text box, you'll see this like edit for, and then it'll pull in the model specifically for a particular part of the model. So the model all comes in as kind of like one big bunch, and then you have the different fields that you have accessible to you for changing. All right. Now, really, once again, like the heart of all of this really is a form-based type of approach. If you guys do a right-click view source on this and start to just take a look at what was automatically generated, all the work is really happening inside of a form. And I want you to look at this and its code as we explore. So the form has an action. Isn't that interesting? Even the form actions are using that same syntax in order to trigger the application. So that shows you how integral it is to the whole structure. Notice that in this case it's a post, so it's actually going to be on the back end once you hit the submit button or the save or whatever it's called on here. But otherwise, if you start scanning down, it really is standard form elements that are being generated ultimately on the back end. Nothing really weird happening here. You see standard inputs. I mean, you do see all of the Bootstrap CSS stuff in here. You don't have to really trouble your mind too much with that. If you do want to learn about Bootstrap, though, there are lots of great tutorials and sites out on the internet that tell you what all these class names do. But then notice here that on some of these, and you should have learned about this in Web 2, you see that data prefix. And if you learned about that data prefix, that allows us to create custom attributes that get passed to the application. And that really kind of triggers the application to say, hey, this is data that I'm using. And here's a really actually like tangible example of that, where I think maybe in the Web 2 class we didn't have as much of a tangible example in a practical sense, but here it is being used in MVC 5. I'm going to go ahead and close that. Go back to regular Zoom. All right, so we're talking about how the form was working just a moment ago. And then you get to the point where you hit that button, right? And then the button sends off to the application the information, and then hopefully does something with it. And then on the receiving end, what's happening is what we're seeing here in this code coming up on bottom of 101, top of 102. So notice that this is actually still part of the store manager edit. So where is it posting to? Back to itself. You're seeing this? So this controller is calling it basically another method within itself. And notice that they have this part of it now, which I think is pretty interesting, where they're actually building in security features into these applications, because as soon as we figure out how to build something, there's some clever person going, well, I know how to screw it up too. And this is kind of an automatic in a lot of senses. But then once it comes in, it will start to issue a couple of different commands here. And then notice that it runs this method here called the action result. And the action result for edit. So this is different than the method for edit, which triggered this, right? So that put our form up on the screen, but now this is like the receiver of the data that's being passed. And then what it does, notice the line right below that where we have a keyword bind, and how it like looks for all the different fields from all our data models, and then basically attaches it to an album and instantiates it on the fly. It does a little bit of checking, and what it does is it makes sure that the data being passed is in the valid format. Hopefully it is, if we didn't miss the code too much. And that's really kind of the key there. If you are editing a lot of the code that's being generated, that's why they throw this stuff in, because that way if you screw it up, it can catch it and basically error trap it. And then if it is data that's valid and is in a format that's okay, then it will actually go ahead and actually save the changes to the database, which is just a method. And then when you're all done, it bops you back to the index method, which is, it just leaves you back in that like list of albums that you worked with, right? Which is what we saw in experience as we changed the price. Pretty simple. Then of course we do have this view bag stuff here, which returns that stuff back to the screen. All right, next section here. I like these titles. He's got a happy path and a sad path, right? And I'm not going to read all that stuff to you, but I do want to just mention, it says here, the happy path is the code you execute when the model is in a valid state and you can save the object in the database, meaning it worked, you're good, right? And then what happens if it's not? That's where the controller kicks in and does that error checking. So if it's not working, what it's going to trigger is another opportunity to make it work, assuming that everything is written correctly. But that, we're kind of assuming that to be the case. So one way you could try that, folks, is, and he's trying to make the point here, is like, what if you type text in for the price? Did we write this validation? No. So the question is, what's making that happen? What is making that happen? So if you go in here and you look, so it said if model state is valid, take all the information right to the database. Great. What if it's a bad request? Well, that's if it can't find the album, right? No ID, it's a bad request. But what if it does find the album? How is it figuring out how to validate those fields? Where is that stuff happening? You see, as I scroll through the code, it's not very apparent, is it? All right, well, that would be the one thing to do. All right, so is this doing it? Probably not. And that's what you should do. You can go through the code. It's one thing if it doesn't find something, but what was the piece of information that we typed in that was bad? Price, right? Where is the price found? Right? Is there anything here that would help us do error catching? Is there any sort of a structure here? I mean, we're declaring basically a private variable, excuse me, a public variable, called price that's a decimal. Could I type in, well, let's try it. Could I type in a whole number? Sure, why not? Because that can be converted. Can I type in a ridiculously large price? Absolutely. Could I type in a number in space? So what's your guess on this then? Where's this coming from? We don't have any code necessarily that's telling us that. What generates this is an intelligent, back-end structure that recognizes that what should go into that field should be numeric and has pre-built error messages that I think are pretty nicely written that work. Now, could I change the title? To a number. here. Right? That's a number. Should I get an error message? No, because that's also text. You see the difference there? So not only is it intelligently doing that error correction for us, but it's also recognizing that, yes, it's possible to actually have a string of numbers be text, and it's treating that way automatically by the way it parses in the data. We don't have to write any special routines. You know, we just came out of the Java class where we were writing stuff that was going into text fields, and we had to parse it as an int or parse it as a double in order to be able to process it and do math on it. All automatic here, folks. It's a beautiful thing. Right. And of course, he demonstrates those concepts explicitly. All right, next section here about model binding. And he makes a little point that, you know, if you didn't know what you were doing here and you wanted to pull values back, you might think about looking directly inside here. So actually, you know, and this is, you know, where the parsing happens. See this? That is not the approach that they're really using here, folks. So that, I think, is kind of interesting. The scaffolding does so much for us that once you get used to building an app in this, you know, format, it's kind of hard to go back to where you had to do everything by hand, right? But at the same time, without the appreciation of doing it by hand, you don't really value what's going on here. Now, will we get to a point someday in the future where all that stuff is handled automatically and we don't even think about it? Perhaps. But I'm always going to say that there's always a need for that kind of base level understanding at the same time. All right, the other thing that we are going to talk about here is this concept of what they call the default model binder. And the interesting thing is because we're passing an ID, it then treats that whole album as an object. And that's really what we're seeing here, why we see the syntax of album. So it's an album of type album. And that's instantiated directly from the database. So it actually pulls a record out, instantiates it on the fly, and my Ruby people will kind of maybe remember this approach, because that's what happens in Ruby on Rails too, where every time we pull data out of whatever our data source is, we kind of instantiate it into being temporarily, and then if we modify it and write it back, that's when the changes happen. We're not necessarily changing it directly on the database. We instantiate it, manipulate it. Sometimes we just look at it. If we do manipulate it and write it back, that's when the transaction happens. Now, here's the little thing that we were looking at before, and he does a little side box on this, and I like the fact that they're building this stuff in now. I mean, that's about my most, I don't know, I'm not sure what word even to use here, my most appreciative form of, like, the fact that they're even thinking about this stuff on our behalf. Because otherwise what would happen in the past is you would have to kind of write your own little techniques here, you know, and this is not like a SQL injection. This is where people are actually like kind of misusing the forms and pumping in too much data. So it's kind of neat that they've done that. The other thing that we can do, rather than using the approach that they just demonstrated, is actually to throw in what they call explicit model binding. So in other words, instead of pulling in something, instantiating it on the fly, manipulating it, and then writing it back, you can actually directly manipulate that data. One of the problems with that, though, and what you'll see in the code below is that you start changing then from using a traditional approach, this more modern MVC approach, to a traditional approach like what you may have learned in your Java classes. So like in Java 2, for example, when we start to do database interactions with our code, one way to make sure that it works is we have exception handling thrown in. So we have our methods throw exceptions if they're not working, and also we put in try catches just in case the interaction fails, because if you cannot interact with the database, you're going to have some issues when you're trying to read and write. So, and it actually kind of explains why they use the other approach. So why do we instantiate to view or to manipulate? It's because it actually creates a buffer between the actual data and the data that we're manipulating at the moment. I think that's kind of an interesting approach. Now, I do come from the school of where when I learned how to do this, it was always try, catch, and exceptions. But it does show you that if you want to use that approach, you still can, but it's not one that's necessarily scaffolded automatically. So it's not going to do that in a different way. Another approach to doing, basically a try catch, and some people will code this way, is just doing an if-else, right? So I mean, same kind of thing. If this is true, then go ahead and do the modifications or changes. Otherwise, just put the stuff back up on the screen and give it another chance. That's kind of a horse apiece. Now, notice with this next thing here, instead of like breaking it down to a try-catch or necessarily an if-else, they do have this separate like method that they're calling here to kind of help with the process. So what that is we're dealing with basically a pre-built method which kind of does the try-catch on your behalf without you having to explicitly code it in. But there's still some error checking that's happening, because you could still be working with data that's not valid and could really screw you up. All right, folks, that actually completes the chapter. And I do want to kind of give you guys some fair warning as you read through these chapters and do some, learning and trying to get this into your head as you're going. At some point, we will potentially have some stuff that we do in here where if I do decide to ask you questions or do something aside from just coding, one spot I always look at when I build quizzes or tests or assignments is sometimes in the summaries of chapters, so don't ignore these. And I think he does a nice job at the end of the chapter kind of recapping everything that you learn, and I do like that approach. All right, that wraps this chapter, folks. We're going to move on to chapter 5 tonight, but we are going to take a break.